Okay, we'll get started. So good afternoon to most of us and good morning to you, Alex, as you are overseas. And thank you all for joining us for this SETS COP webinar on the community sector and strategic innovation lessons from the public sector. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are all on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people whose land I'm on today here in Canberra. So today we have Alex Roberts from the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, OECD. Alex is an innovation specialist, deputy head of OPSI and the lead for country public sector innovation system studies. The Observatory for Public Sector Innovation, OPSI, is a global forum for public sector innovation. OPSI works with governments to understand and encourage new approaches to address society's complex problems by empowering public servants with new insights, knowledge, and tools and connections to help them explore new possibilities. Alex leads the work on the Observatory's studies of the country public sector innovation systems, as well as contributing to the work of OPSI's innovation facets model and on the innovation life cycle. Alex has a long passion for innovation and how the government can do things differently and hopefully better. Before joining the Observatory, Alex worked in the Australian Public Service, where he was one of the lead authors on the report Empowering Change, Fostering Innovation in the Australian Public Service, supported the APS 200 project on public sector innovation, which led to the APS Innovation Action Plan, and helped set up, run and wind down DesignGov, an experimental public sector innovation lab. It's an honour to have you speak with us today, Alex, and particularly with the time difference, we greatly appreciate you making the time to share your insights. And I'll now pass over to you.
Thanks so much, and thank you for having me here today. Just to begin then, I'll just give a quick overview about us at the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, just to give you a little context of where I'm sort of coming from. We tend to concentrate on three main sort of broad things. We do a lot of work around uncovering what is next. So what are the emerging trends and practices in government? So we do a lot of work around looking at trends in public sector innovation, new initiatives by governments, and then looking at the implications of that. What might these new things mean for government? We also do a lot of work around how to turn those new promising things into the new normal. How do you embed those practices? And we have a number of resources, including a toolkit navigator, which provides a whole host of innovation toolkits and helps you navigate between those to see which might be most relevant to your context. And we try and act as a source of trusted advice for governments about how to do all of this innovation practice in a more deliberate, consistent and systemic way. I thought it might be a good idea to just ask you a couple of questions first off. So I've included a link in the chat. I'm just going to share the screen as well. Just to get a bit of a baseline from yourselves, you can just do this on your phone. You don't have to log in or anything. If you just go to the link, www.wooclap.com/MIGCOU. Just to help us get a little sort of sense of where each of you are coming from. So you'll see an option there to just write in a word about words about what innovation means to you. And these will come up. So if you can just go to that link. So we've got experimentation, creativity, change, improvement, different groups, new ideas, fun, considered risk, effectiveness, implementation of new ideas, responding to challenges, moving forward and upward. So I think these are all things, words that are often used in association with innovation. So that's good to see. Okay. It's just helpful to get a sense of where different people are coming from in the concept. The next one I'm going to ask you then, in your interactions with the public sector, in your work, or even as a citizen, do you regard the public sector as being innovative? Got some mixed views so far. So I'm seeing a bit of skepticism here. So a bit of a mixed view. Some people think yes, most think in the neutral somewhat sort of territory, and a few definitely not so much. Okay, then one third and final question. How innovative do you think your own organization is? Is it a core part of how you work? Do you just, you often have innovative projects, or we do some things that are new to us in our work sometimes, or we don't really innovate? Okay, so we're getting a few who think there's a fair amount of innovation going on, but it's not necessarily a core part of the organization's identity. One who thinks innovation is very much integrated, and a few think it's more of a partial sort of activity. But no one's saying they don't really innovate. Okay. That's just helpful for me to get a sense of where each of you are at sort of in your own innovation journey. I'm now going to go back to our slides. So I had a lot of sort of words there about what innovation is, and I'm going to just spend a little bit of time on that because it's an important part of this conversation. Last year, as the pandemic started to unfold, we at OPSI created a tracker to see about different innovative responses happening by different governments all around the world, get a sense of how governments were dealing with this. And it gave rise to one of my favorite examples of public sector innovation. There was a school in China where they asked all the primary school students before coming back to school to create and wear 1 meter hats, so that the children would understand the concept of social distancing. Now, it doesn't involve any new technology. It's not particularly sophisticated, but it's an adaptation to a difficult circumstance to help communicate an important idea to an audience that's not necessarily always readily going to engage with social distancing. So it's a cute example for me, but also an important example of how innovation can really matter, even if it doesn't involve technology. As part of our trends work, we collect cases every year to try and identify those trends and to pull out what we see as important or emerging examples. One year, I think this was 2018, we showcased this example from the city of Hamburg about using augmented technology to help with discussions and planning for the settlement of refugees in the city of Hamburg. So just using something as simple as Lego blocks to represent different parts of or different allocations of where refugees might be placed across the city, and overlaying that with an augmented reality view of the city itself, just to enable better, more sophisticated conversations about with citizens about where refugees might be placed and where the access to services might be, and those sorts of things. So some use of technology, but an important way of making these conversations a bit more real for citizens and helping understand the issues. So just more in your field of work. In terms of how we think of public sector innovation, there's three sort of main characteristics that we talk about. One, that it needs to be new to the context. Can't be something that's already been done. It has to be, secondly, it has to be implemented. It can't just be an idea. It's actually got to be made real. And thirdly, that it needs to have impact. It needs to have changed something, hopefully for the positive, but not always. There needs to be something you can show for it. Simple enough, but it soon gets into a more challenging conversation. Just sort of in response to those different views about is the public sector innovative? Well, last year we saw a lot of innovation unlocked through the pandemic. Governments had to change what they were doing, sometimes in very substantial ways. And we saw a mix of different types of innovation activity, ranging everything from, how to improve infection control and track who might have been exposed and so on, improving communications, providing targeted information. Another favorite example of mine there was Corona Kids, a Portuguese website was created for communicating with children specifically about the pandemic, which was a great example of tailored communication. We saw a lot of service delivery in a crisis adjusting to context, so a lot of digital service provision. A lot of social solidarity and caremongering movements where communities stepped up to, and sometimes businesses stepped up to provide support to vulnerable members of the community. A lot of leveraging and redeploying existing resources and solutions. So drawing on capabilities that were already there, but in new ways. An example there was the Swedish SAS, the airline, training some of their air stewards in medical care, just to help the hospitals with the surge capacity. We saw a lot of open calls, hackathons, and other challenge-based mechanisms. There was a worldwide we versus the virus hackathon that created some interesting things in Latvia. Out of that, the Maker movement contributed some new face shields that were of higher quality and better standard and reusable, and therefore cheaper than anything the Latvian public service could have procured. And they were quickly used in hospitals. There were also adaptive responses by legislatures, so governments had to change what they were doing. And there were some other collective learning and sense-making things and structural responses and longer-term shifts. I'm just pointing that out, so not to say that the government or the public sector is always innovative, it certainly isn't, but the last year has really challenged all of us to be thinking about how we need to do things differently. We had certainly a platform that required us to revisit and rethink some of our core activities. And, you know, are we doing things in the way we had to do them? Or, as we're seeing, quite a number of things we were doing and the ways we were working were actually quite arbitrary. We didn't have to be doing it in that way. We could be doing it in new ways. It's also a help to unpack innovation a bit more, that it's one word with a lot of uses, and it's talking about a lot of different things. So firstly, it can be an outcome. It can be a product or a service or an organizational change and so on. So a new government service, a new way of working, a new way of engaging or relating with citizens and stakeholders, a new way of procurement and so on. But it can also be the process itself. How do you support turning an idea into reality? What are the steps and mechanisms by which you help that happen, or ensure that you filter the very many ideas that are out there to pick the ones that are most promising and to concentrate and invest in those? And then it can also be even more broad than that. It can be about the support that's offered for that process. So a government might issue an innovation fund to fund promising things, whether in government or with stakeholders and service providers. So here we start to get to the sense that innovation, while an important concept, has a number of nuances that we can unpack. And one of those is that when we use the word innovation, we're actually talking about quite a lot of different things. When we started our work at OPSI, one of the things we'd often have in conversations was, well, what do you really mean by innovation? And so we could give examples and we could talk about the process and such. But then we'd have to note that, well, it can be all sorts of different things. And we came out with what we call our innovation facets model to really help unpack that. So when we're talking about innovation in the public sector, we have two sort of axes that we can talk about. You can be dealing with things that are more or less uncertain, and whether they're more or less directed, where you have an intent or a clear sort of outcome you're aiming towards. So we have four sorts of facets. We have enhancement-oriented innovation. So a classic example here that some of you might be aware of and familiar with is the use of behavioral insights or behavioral economics, or what's sometimes referred to as nudges, where government tries to help, say, increase the compliance for payments on time, whether fines or taxes. So a lot of governments have experimented, for instance, with how they draft their letters or messages to citizens about these things, experimenting with different formats and different messaging. There's been a lot of work, for instance, that's found if you talk to people about their energy consumption and you emphasize that they, what the community norm is, what other people's households use, and so you'll often see in your electricity bill how you compare. That's an important nudge that can help people reduce their energy consumption. We also have adaptive innovation. So that's where it's more bottom up, where people are in the field, for instance, and they respond to what they see. There might be a policy intent, but they might see a gap between that intent and what's actually happening on the ground, and look at how to deal with that. An example here might be the use of what's called positive deviance, where you look at people who are doing things differently in the community and asking, well, those are the sorts of behaviors that we want to see. What is it that's helping them succeed where others might not be? An example in the migration space might be where you have a particular community that thrives in settlement. What might be particular about those people, and are there lessons that can be drawn from that, and how can they sort of pass those messages and lessons on to others? At the opposite end, we have what we call mission-oriented innovation. A lot of this work has been pushed by the economist Mariana Mazzucato, who's done some great work on thinking about missions. Classic example, of course, of a public sector mission was putting a man on the moon. So a big, audacious goal that's very existence sort of pushes and requires different parts of government and outside of government to work together to achieve things in new ways. I tried to think of an example here in the migration thing, but I couldn't think of not all missions are good, so I couldn't think of one there. But the key lesson is that it's big, audacious goals by government of saying, I don't know, how to, well, classic examples are at the moment to do with sustainable development goals by governments, dealing with climate change. Classic example in Germany was their energy revolution, where they've shifted to renewable energy in a wholehearted way. And that's required changes through the industry, through employment, in all sorts of ways. And then finally, in that more uncertain space, more exploratory and radical space, we have what we call anticipatory innovation, where you're engaging with weak signals before they're sort of locked in. So that might be the use of scenarios or strategic foresight to think about what might be the upcoming changes in the nature of migration patterns or the needs of immigrants, or other sorts of things like that. Thinking and challenging our assumptions about the future, and how we might need to, how that might change both what we need to do and how we do it. I know there's a lot of sort of big picture stuff here, but I'm trying to set the scene here to help you understand these different elements, because it's really important in unpacking public sector innovation to get a feel for these different sorts of intent. To help illustrate that, here are some sort of activating questions for each of those facets. Like enhancement-oriented innovation is really just about that question of, well, how can we do whatever activity better? How can we leverage our existing investments, our existing skills and structures and so on, and just get more juice out of that lemon? Mission-oriented innovation, it's about that, how might we achieve that big audacious goal? Adaptive, well, it's about recognizing that things on the ground might be changing, and so going, well, how might our evolved situation change how we do what we're trying to do? Then finally, anticipatory, well, how might emerging possibilities fundamentally change what X could or should be? An example here is when we think about the future of work, for instance, and we think about the possibility of automation. You know, you get into some big questions about, well, what is the purpose of work? What is the form of work? What is it that it should be looking like? Some of those questions can be big and scary, but they're important to engage with early on, because it's not change you can make overnight. We can also start to use the facets as a lens for thinking about that there are different forms of support that, that these different types of innovation activity benefit from different forms of support. An example here is the different sorts of tools and methods that can be used that tend to align with activity in those sorts of spaces. If you have a hammer, you're going to tend to want to hammer things. Similarly, a lot of the tools that we have available to us and methods we have available to us are going to push us and our activities in certain directions. So in the mission-oriented space, if you're using systems thinking, you're going to be thinking about the big picture. You're going to be thinking about what are those outcomes we're driving towards and how might we get there. Positive deviance, as I mentioned, in the adaptive space, behavioral insights and business process improvement in the enhancement space, horizon scanning, strategic foresight, and so on in the anticipatory space. It's not to say that everyone needs to be an expert in all of these, or can be, or that any organization will be across all of these. It's very hard for one organization to be good at all of these things. And sometimes it probably shouldn't be aiming to be. But it's about helping us unpack and think about why are we doing the sorts of innovation activity that we are doing? And is that the sort of mix we want to be doing? Building on that, we can talk about there being an innovation portfolio, a mix of innovation activity. Everyone has an innovation portfolio. It might not be very big, might not be very sophisticated, and it might not be very explicit or deliberate, but everyone's doing some innovation in some way. This is just an example from a country that we worked with, just to demonstrate that there's a lot of mix of innovation activity that will occur across a whole of public service. And recognizing that you will want some mix of activity. Now, this isn't to say any one of your organizations will have that many projects, but it might be an interesting question, for instance, to think about over all of your, you as a collective, is there innovation activity happening in these different sorts of areas? Are there ways that you can learn from each other about the different types of innovation activity that each of you may or may not be doing? And recognizing that, like investment, you don't want to be putting all of your eggs in one basket when it comes to innovation, because there's a high chance with all of the uncertainty that we're all dealing with, that you may have picked the wrong basket. You want to be able to hedge your bets in some ways. This slide is just to reflect that it's also important to think about that when you do innovative things, not all innovation is good. Quite a lot of it can be less than good. And that's especially true in the public sector. You're dealing with people's lives and livelihoods, and there needs to be care taken because of that. And sometimes when you get into innovation, you get into some pretty thorny things. So I won't go into this in detail, but to take that anticipatory innovation area, in terms of how that can sort of, what it means for core values about how what people value. It can expose, interrogate, challenge, and undermine your sort of core values and beliefs. So if we take the example of anticipatory innovation again, of automation and the future of work. If you tell people, well, one day all of your jobs might be taken by robots, that's a pretty confronting thing to be told, especially in the world we're in now, where everyone sees themselves as, their job is a big part of their identity. That's pretty threatening to say that might be gone. So you can then also have reactions to innovative things. Resistance to innovation is quite common and understandable, because you are dealing with these core values, these core beliefs and things, and you're asking people to change. And as we all know, not all of us will be at our best when we're asked to do that. And sometimes that resistance or reluctance will be very well justified. That's just another sort of nuance we have to think of, particularly in the public sector or adjacent to the public sector, because we are dealing with some important stuff. But I'm sure some of you are asking, well, what does this really mean in practice for me and my work? How can I apply any of this to what I'm doing? Well, some core questions I think that, we're all capable of asking and thinking about is, well, what is it that we're really trying to achieve or do? And where might we need to do things differently in order to achieve that? If you've got a clear sense of what you're trying to drive at, it's much easier to understand how change and innovation might play a role in that. It's not then something extra, it's not then a burden. It's about thinking, well, as part of achieving my vision, my mission, my objectives, the things I want to achieve for my stakeholders or my community, what is it that I'm going to need to change to get there? You might not always know that answer, but recognizing that in today's topsy-turvy world, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to do everything you want to do without changing something. So recognizing that innovation is a part of your journey in getting to where you need to go. It's also about asking ourselves, well, what are our assumptions about the future? And what if things work out sometimes very, very differently? If I asked all of you just over a year ago about what was coming, I'm fairly sure most of us would have been terribly, terribly wrong about what that was going to look like and how it was going to play out. That's okay. I mean, no one's we're not saying anyone can or should be trying to predict the future, but it's about testing ourselves and our assumptions and going, well, if things play out differently, how can we make sure that we're still going to achieve what we need to achieve? How can we make sure that our objectives aren't going to be sacrificed because of a change context? How can we test our strategies, our assumptions, our working processes to make them more resilient to a different set of possible futures? It's also about asking ourselves, what are the risks of not changing? What are the risks of sticking with the way we do things now? And how might we try out different experiments without risking that core work, our core responsibilities? Sorry. Not every innovation has to be big, as we saw, or involve technology. How can we do small experiments that help us learn without jeopardizing the core responsibilities? And also, what are others doing that we can learn from, draw inspiration from? One of the biggest things we do at the observatory is collect those examples from different countries. We have hundreds in our database. And that's a really important part for public servants and others, is to see just who else is doing things, because that can make the innovation process much easier when you have these other tangible examples of interesting ideas in practice. And then what lessons can you share with others from your own experiments? How can you have those conversations? And then finally, before we dive into some questions, as I'm sure that there are, some tips, bits of helpful advice, hopefully. Well, innovation can be hard and sometimes really personally challenging. Again, asking ourselves to change, asking other people to change their behaviors and sometimes their beliefs is a big deal. There's no easy answer to that. We know that. You just have to look at the rise and fall of companies. No one masters this forever. It's something that is hard work. But as someone mentioned, it can be fun. And it's also important to know that we can't stand still. Again, the pandemic has shown us that things are going to change, and sometimes really fast and in really big ways. And it's always easier to be a part of a change process than it is to have change happen or be inflicted upon us. So part of this is about also our own personal and organizational resilience. It's about thinking about, well, how do we engage with this changing world rather than the changing world just happening to us? Then it's recognizing that innovation takes investment and care, but it doesn't always take money. often, as always, money does tend to make a lot of things easier, but not always with innovation. Sometimes constraint is the most powerful driver of innovation. Recognizing that there are things we want to achieve and there are limits around how we might, the options open to us, forces us to be more creative, to think in new ways. And there are a lot of new technologies and options out there now that aren't always expensive. And you will get better at it with practice. I know in my own personal innovation journey, the questions I ask myself now are very different to those I was asking myself over 10 years ago when I started on public sector innovation. And I've seen in so many different countries and areas, the capability and the understanding of innovation as a practice and a tool to drive to better outcomes has been significant. Asking yourself, where can you start is a key question. What experiments or changes can you do right now, even without any more time, resources, or money? Now, there are always things in your life, in your job, in your role that you can experiment with. They might be small things, but what are those different ways of doing things, different ways of testing, different small experiments that will teach you more about what works and what doesn't, that can then maybe inform bigger, more ambitious innovation goals or projects that might require more resources in time. Whether it's your 1 meter hat or whether it's a bigger sort of IT project that requires significant investment and rethinking of core work, there are a lot of options open to us. Again, this big, scary, changing world is much less scary when we recognize that each of us plays a role in making that change and working with that change. And that leads to the final point as well, that innovation is a team sport. And asking ourselves, well, who are my allies? Who are the others who are on my team? Who can I work with? Who can I share experiences with, such as this community of practice? Because all of this gets much less daunting if you have colleagues and partners that you can share with and talk through and learn from. Innovation is inherently a social activity. We're trying to make change happen, and that's about people. So it's much easier if we have people working with us to achieve it. Now, I don't know how you want to run questions.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Alex. That was fantastic. You provided some really tangible and practical ways, I guess, to apply innovation. I think a lot of the time people see this kind of vague definition of what innovation is. So that model really helps. And what I really got out of it was that innovation portfolio and how you need to look at how you diversify your approach to innovation. So thank you so much for that. We'll open up to questions now. We've had a few trickle in as you've been speaking, Alex, and I can ask them through to you. And please, anyone else who has any questions, please feel free to send them through as well. So the first question that we have is, in your opinion, which facet is most important to spark innovation in the community sector? So you provided some examples, but yeah, is there one that you think is a standout for the community sector?
Often where we see a lot of innovation in working with the community sector is in that adaptive innovation space, where you're working with the community and you might be the ones who see, well, the government's got that goal or ambition, and that's great. But when I actually talk to people in the community, what I hear and what I see is that service or that intent doesn't quite work out the same way on the ground. So when I'm, a classic example going back a few years though now is when Centrelink or Department of Human Services, when they started to engage with social media, because they saw different conversations going on in the ground about how people were using their services or the questions they were having about their services. And then sometimes they will go to community groups and so on to say, well, obviously they're always wary of giving explicit advice, but saying, when you're talking with your stakeholders about these things, here are some core things to note, and using social media in a new way, responding to that change on the ground. I'm sure there are so many different things when you're dealing with a diverse community, such as different migrant groups, that the implementation on the ground will look different to what was intended in the policy paper back at the department. There's rich learning there, and helping translate that through innovation, either for or on behalf of the government, or with the government, or sometimes in spite of the government. A lot of that happens in that adaptive space.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. Another question that we have is, what are some of the challenges to innovation or innovative thinking?
I could write a book, and there are many books on this, but it comes back to that core thing of you're asking people to change when you're doing innovation. And how people respond to change is very different. So when you're asking decision makers, or when you're liaising with different stakeholders, each of them are going to be coming at it from a different angle. And because when you're dealing or talking about something new, you don't have a set sort of benchmark or framework to say, well, this is what this means, and this is what it's going to look like in practice. You're asking people to engage in a sort of act of faith or act of imagination, and that can be hard. That's why a lot of innovation practice in the last few years has concentrated on the use of design thinking, because that really emphasizes how do you make these things tangible, whether visible through mock-ups or walkthroughs, or when you mock up a website or so on. How do you make these things real as fast as possible, so that people start to react to things and give you a sense of how they're interpreting these things? Because when you give someone something really new, if they don't have a sort of ready mental model of it in their own head, it can take quite a long time to talk through that and to make sure everyone's actually understanding it from the same angle. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks, Alex. Next question that we have is, how can we demonstrate innovation to government in funding applications?
That's going to be hard too, because every government agency is going to interpret these things a bit differently. But it's about demonstrating, I think, if you hit on those three things of what was novel about it to the context, how had this not been done before in that setting? How was it made real? How was it implemented? What was done to on the ground to make that real? And what are the impacts that it's had, to illustrate as much as you can the tangible nature of that innovation? Those are the good sorts of things. And our own case study library on our observatory website, there are some core sorts of questions that we ask people about how to share their story, and that might be a useful model. We've iterated that over a number of years to really boil down to what are the sorts of core things you need to convey in telling a good story about innovation. Obviously, a lot of public servants are just going to be concerned about, sorry, allergy at the moment, concerned about results. And the challenge with innovation is that it can be hard to show all of those results straight off the bat, because when you're doing something new, it's not going to be as good as something that you've been doing for 15 years. But it's about showing you're responding to changes on the ground, that you're doing well, and highlighting the risks of staying with the status quo. showing how change is needed.
Wonderful, thanks, Alex. We've got another question here. Is innovation closely related to a strengths-based approach?
Yes and no. I think it's important to build off and start with your strengths, but you don't want to be locked into your strengths either, because those strengths can become weaknesses over time or sometimes overnight. We need to build in a bit of redundancy or resilience into our systems. Start with where you're strong, but recognize that those strengths are changeable. It's also taking that portfolio-based approach enables and helps you to think about the broader ecosystem that you're working in. You don't have to be good at everything, and you can't be, but others will be good at some things, and you better at them than at other things. Working out your partnerships, and whether formal or informal, can be really important. How can you leverage the learning that other groups are doing for your own efforts? So recognizing the strengths, I guess, of your own relationships and networks is as much a part of that.
Excellent. Next question we have is, could you speak to the element of safety for people and clients with tension between safety and disruptive change?
Yeah, look, it's a very real concern. And when you're dealing with vulnerable people, you don't want to be doing big dramatic experiments with them. So it's about thinking about, well, how do you portion those risks appropriately? How do you, are there groups that are less vulnerable that you can try some of these things out with first? How can you draw on lessons in adjacent areas? How can you how can you do smaller bite-sized sorts of experiments rather than doing it all at once? It's also about drawing on those methodologies such as positive deviance and so on, where you look for those who are already thriving or succeeding, and working backwards with them to unpack why that's the case and how they can teach or showcase to others how to draw on that in their own lives. There's a whole website about positive deviance, and it's got some fantastic examples from some very vulnerable communities in less advantaged nations that are very inspiring. And it also has that important lesson of, when you're dealing with very vulnerable people, about how you can bring them along on this journey rather than doing things to them, doing things with them. That's not always easy, especially when you're asking them to change or changing things around them. But it's an important principle.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alex. Next question is social impact investing a catalyst for innovation? If so, how?
That's a big question. I'd have to say from the evidence we've seen, the answer would be it's mixed. I think we're still understanding when and where it can be used best. And I don't think that's clear yet. There have been some success stories, but I don't think they've been easily replicated, which suggests this is more complex than many of these things might have been thought at the beginning, which is always the case. You have some fantastic examples and everyone realizes, oh, there was a lot more to it than what was on the box. So yes, it can be a catalyst because it can force people to think about what is it you're actually trying to drive change towards. But it's also very complex because, as we know, these simple measurements sit atop very complex systems, and what the levers of change rely on a lot of things that aren't always causal or one-to-one.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Next question, I'm mindful of time, so we'll just ask a couple more. Has innovation changed over time, and will it continue to do so, if so?
Yes, one of the things that makes innovation more difficult than a lot of other activities, core corporate responsibilities, is that, yes, the more you learn about innovation, the more it changes itself as a practice. So the last sort of wave of innovation has, certainly in the public sector, has been strongly drawing on design and design thinking, because design inherently is an enabling technology, an enabling language for collaborating on complex things. It's about making things visible, about tangible, about iterating, and so on. As we've drawn more on IT and digital transformation, then things like agile methodologies have been more important also. Because again, iterative, short, sprint-based, you concentrate your learning, then move on, and so on. We're starting to see a wider and a more deep engagement with systems thinking now, because as we work through the easier changes, we realize all of these things are interconnected and complex. And so we need that thinking to think about how those relationships are, what are the dynamics of the system, what are the most influential levers of change. And now, yes, we at OPSI are doing a lot of work on the anticipatory innovation governance space, about thinking about how do you build structures and processes to most effectively enable that anticipatory approach to work, because there's a long history of foresight and so on that hasn't necessarily led to concrete results on the ground. So yes, as we learn more about what we need to do, and we draw on new and different methodologies to help us do that.
Yeah, excellent. I think that makes it even more exciting and more, interesting for people to start thinking that way and start looking at how they can be more innovative, acknowledging that, over time it does change and it does adapt to what's going on in the world.
And the key point, sorry, just, with all of this, it all gets much, much easier once you start. You can very easily, and the public service is very, very good at trying to perfect everything on paper before trying and starting. That doesn't help you. Innovation is about structured learning, and it means you have to do something to learn. So we all have to just get started.
Excellent. All right, we've got a couple of questions coming through. We'll try to fit as many as we can in the last 5 minutes. Is there anything particular that the pandemic showed up about what we thought we knew about innovation? So is there something in particular that the pandemic has really shifted in the innovation space?
That's a good question. I think in part it's about the limits of digital transformation. The pandemic has been a rapid acceleration of digital transformation as an agenda in a lot of governments. It's pushed everything online. Here in Paris, I've been teleworking from home for nearly a year, and there are limits to being divorced from people. We're seeing the limits of those things. We are social animals, and this has perhaps highlighted that a lot more viscerally than the path we were on might have wanted to engage with. So I think we are going to start seeing potentially some questions about, well, there's a hell of a lot we can do online and should do, but how do we make sure there are safeguards and human aspects to our structures and systems that stick with that, because until we're all uploaded into the cloud, there are limits to this. I think it's also shown, and a message that we're trying to pass on to governments is that a lot of the countries that have been most successful, or a lot of the organizations that have been most successful in this, in responding to the pandemic, were those that had invested in some of this stuff beforehand. Innovation can involve a steep learning curve, and when you're trying to do all the learning at the same time as dealing with a pandemic, that's not great. If you've already, the countries that had already engaged, or the organizations that had already engaged with some of the digital stuff beforehand, were much more comfortably placed to shift services online. So recognizing that innovation doesn't come out of nowhere, I think that's an important message, that austerity and cutting costs will get you some of the way, and can be needed, but it's not suitable for all things.
Yeah, absolutely. The value of being proactive rather than reactive. Yeah.
And this is an investment. It's not a...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. We have one last question. So where can we find more information or resources? You've mentioned a couple of resources that sound fantastic, but where can we get more information and resources from?
So the Observatory website, where there are two things that might be useful. Our Innovation Toolkit Navigator is a useful resource. It's targeted towards public servants, but it's open to all. And it provides, I think we've got a couple of hundred different innovation toolkits there and resources there. And it sort of tries to structure that and provide some navigation for working out what might be most relevant or useful for your context, and lets you sort of dip your toes into some of these things. None of this is about trying to say you'll become an auteur or an adept at some of these innovation methods overnight, but there are some small practical, even checklist approaches for some of these things about, well, how can you apply some design thinking or so on in your job. Another useful element is our database of innovation projects. So I had a quick look. There are some on migration there, I think, but even drawing from tangential adjacent fields can help, just to expand your realm of the possible. And finally, there's something we call our portfolio exploration tool, which is a new self-service sort of thing that can help you think about, particularly for larger organizations, the mix of innovation activity, how are you supporting the different types of innovation activity, and also what mix of innovation projects you have, and how you might place them along those facets to help start those conversations about what is our portfolio and is it what we want it to be.
Absolutely. And if it's okay, Alex, I might get those links off you and where those resources are, and share that with the attendees in the coming days. I think that'll be really valuable. All right, we might finish up. Well, thank you so much, Alex, for your presentation today on strategic innovation. I, for one, found it extremely valuable, as it provided like a really practical application of innovation to the community sector and more broadly. Really appreciate your insights and you taking the time, particularly since it's very early in the morning for you there. But yeah, really appreciate and know that we as a sector will be taking on this information and being able to apply it more to the work that we do. Thank you so much again, and thank you everyone for participating in all the questions, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
See you. Bye.